Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh dan selamat pagi. Terima kasih kepada anda yang sudi menonton kami pada pagi ini. Alhamdulillah, pada pagi berbagi ini kita bersua kembali untuk kita sama-sama menyaksikan dan juga berkumpul secara penseriman dalam talian untuk kita menyaksikan pelancaran laporan Building Resilience Towards Inclusive Social Protection in Malaysia melalui gagasan yang telah pun dilakukan oleh pendidik-pendidik di bawah Khazanah Research Institute ataupun KRI. Untuk kita memberikan sedikit gambaran permulaan ataupun mukadimahnya, molek untuk kita gambarkan dengan suasana terkini pandemik COVID-19. Sudah pastinya banyak isu-isu yang dibangkitkan. Namun begitu, isu-isu tentang sistem perlindungan keselamatan sosial adalah perkara yang penting dan paling utama untuk ditekankan, memandangkan kita melihat kepada bagaimana situasi yang sedia berlaku, kesenjangan dalam perlindungan keselamatan masyarakat yang berlaku pada ketika ini. Maka ia menghadirkan satu solusi dan juga satu resolusi serta inisiatif yang dilakukan oleh para penyelidik di bawah Khazanah Research Institute untuk melakukan kajian laporan berkaitan sudah fokus sistem perlindungan keselamatan sosial di negara kita, juga dengan beberapa laporan dan juga beberapa penyidikan yang diambil dapatan data daripada dapatan data dari luar dan juga dari luar negara untuk kita menggambarkan situasi itu dalam terjemahan yang lebih baik ke atas sistem negara kita. Ini antara wajah-wajah panelis yang akan bersama dengan anda. Hawati Abdul Hamid, Siti Aisyah Tumin, Adam Manaf Muhammad Firuz, Nur Thuraya Razali, Jared Ramadan Khalidi dan Putri Marjan Megat Muzaffar. Juga mereka merupakan antara penyelidik yang bertanggungjawab dalam memberikan laporan dan juga pembentangan laporan. Baik, kita akan beralih ke sesi yang seterusnya. Kita terus saja untuk kita bercakap lebih lanjut tentang tujuan utama kita pada pagi ini. Panel discussion ataupun bersama dengan panel kita. This discussion will be conducted both in Malay and English. So, we'll start off with Hawa to talk about the relationship between COVID-19 and the situation. Dikatakan oleh yang berbagai tansri tadi sudah pasti mempunyai hubungan antara sistem perlindungan keselamatan sosial dan juga pandemik COVID-19. Untuk Hawa, the question is, COVID-19 had glaring inadequacy of social protection around the world. And in your opinion, why advancing social protection agenda has become more critical nowadays, especially in Malaysia? And what are the most critical paradigm shifts that need to take place? Please, Hawa.
Terima kasih Ismail, and Assalamualaikum and a very good morning to everyone. And it's true, Ismail, that COVID-19 have exposed a lot of gaps in our social protection system in Malaysia. With so many, we have seen so many people have fallen through the cracks as people lose their job, they fall sick, and children who lose their parent. And indeed, this crisis is extraordinary, and we have seen that government have to urgently deploy sizable temporary relief measure to assist the people. But at the same time, I think this also shows that we have not been investing enough in the past to build a resilient and inclusive social protection that covers everyone. That's first. And secondly, at the same time, there are also several major forces that coming on our way that we need to have to be prepared of. These include, for example, rapid population aging, informalization of work due to a disruption of technology, and climate change. And if we don't do anything, this will only exacerbate inequality if we continue with the status quo. And that is why it is very critical that we need to advance the discussion on social protection reform, and we need to reconfigure our system now before we face a lot more challenges. So in this report, we are trying to advocate a few paradigm shifts in the thinking of social protection. First, we need to recognize that social protection or access to social security is a human right. This means that we have to move away from this charity paradigm or welfare paradigm that can be very stigmatizing. but instead we have to move towards this right-based approach where we acknowledge that social security or social protection is a right of everyone, as it is entitlement of the citizen. Secondly, we need to also, in the approach of our social protection, it has to be forward-looking in preventing poverty and addressing vulnerability, rather than we are reactive in trying to help people when they have fallen into poverty. I mean, it is good that we are trying to help the poor, but poverty targeting is not, poverty targeting alone is not enough in the social protection policy, which brings me to my third point, that we need to build a system, a long-lasting system that cover everyone from major risks. I mean, we all face risks, and probably today we are not poor, but we can face any risk, catastrophe that will affect us. And that's why it has to be a system that put in place. It is not safety net that is short term or ad hoc in nature. It has to be a built system. And in the speech just now, Tan Sri Noor was talking about this notion of resilience. And we don't have resilience if we don't have the capacity to protect people. And that's why it is really important that we have to start the conversation now and try to protect our citizens from all walks of life. And we have seen that a lot of countries who are resilient, they have invested long before, and they have shown that they are more responsive during this crisis, and they are also economically and socially resilient. That's it, Ismail.
Thank you so much, Howard. That was a brief and conclusive explanation. Moving on to Adam, there's a question arise regarding the report highlighted several gaps. In your opinion, what are the long-standing issues in our social protection system, and how do we
Thank you, Ismail. Assalamualaikum and good morning to everyone. So the issues with Malaysia's social protection system, essentially they boil down to issues with coverage of the population, coverage of the risk which the population is protected against, and lastly, the adequacy of the protection provided. This is something that Tan Sri Noor mentioned in his speech, and something that Howard touched on more a bit, but let me explain a bit more. So on one pillar of social protection in Malaysia, we have social assistance, and this refers to non-contributory schemes which are fully funded by government. Typically, these are highly targeted for the poor and P40 households, as well as other vulnerable groups. A well-known example is Bantuan Prihatin Rakyat, which we have today. Previously, it was known as BRIM. But however, an issue with social assistance stems exactly from its practice of trying to help only the deserving, as deemed by the government. And this is because the act of targeting is hardly an exact science, regardless of whether we use the poverty line income threshold or the B40 threshold, because at the end of the day, it's all quite subjective in terms of who you decide is eligible. And we are bound to miss out many people who are in need, especially those who are just above the line, the margin. So this issue signifies a large gap in coverage. Another issue with targeting is that the obsession with it, perhaps justified by fiscal space, is that it has led to an over-proliferation of programs. So in 2012, there were 97 programs, but by 2020, the number rose to 137 programs. And this is before even including all the COVID-19 programs. And this trend illustrates the worsening fragmentation and discoordination we have, at least at the federal government level. And it's especially when you consider that these programs, they're administered by various different ministries who each have their different data registries and targeting practices. So this signifies pretty significant administrative burden. But despite all this, the total direct spending on the benefits, the assistance across these programs has actually dropped. So from 45 billion all the way down to 25 billion. And this drop shows how spending is being spread more and more thinly across these programs, and how the value of assistance remains inadequate. So that's on social assistance. On the second pillar of social protection in Malaysia, we have social insurance. And these are contributory schemes that work via an insurance mechanism. And they are contributory because you have to be contributing the monthly insurance premiums in order to benefit. So examples include the various worker protection schemes under SOCSO, against risks such as work injury and unemployment. And then for the old age, we have the EPF retirement savings schemes. Of course, the others, but these are some of the major ones. So all these programs, they have legal backing, and we think that it makes these programs a lot more sustainable compared with social assistance, which at the end of the day, it's highly down to political will. But unfortunately, the benefits of these social insurance programs, they continue to be limited to former employees who are able to make these contributions together with the employers. And this leaves out many workers in Malaysia who happen to be in informal employment, as well as housewives who they themselves do really meaningful work for the nation. Also, there are no legal provisions for family and childhood, which is a key risk identified by international conventions for social protection. So overall, when you put these two pillars together of social assistance and social insurance, we have this issue of a missing middle, because these people in the middle, they might not be considered poor enough to be entitled to social assistance, but yet they may not benefit from social insurance because they perhaps they work informally and they can't make contributions to the social insurance schemes. So given these issues, we need a paradigm shift towards a more inclusive system where all individuals in Malaysia are included, regardless of whether they are rich or poor. Because after all, most, if not everyone, face risk throughout their lifetime, which could see them falling into poverty. So by being more inclusive, we can be a lot more forward-looking and prevent anyone from becoming poor. So to achieve this, we also call for a life cycle approach, where we protect everyone against well-documented risks, which they may face in each phase of life, from childhood to the working age, where they may face risk of work injury, unemployment, for example, and then to the old age, where they need to make sure that they have sufficient retirement savings. So our recommendations, they follow practices and conventions from globally, which are long and well established. So we do not necessarily have to reinvent the wheel. Thank you, Ismail.
All right, thank you, Adam, for the explanation. Now, moving on to Jared. Well, the report sees childhood as an important yet vulnerable stage of life. In your opinion, also, what is this case, and what can we do to make sure no child is left behind, especially in Malaysia?
Thanks, Ismail. Yep, as you rightfully mentioned, childhood is an important stage of one's life. It is a period of rapid development, and it's when foundational capabilities from cognitive gains to emotional abilities are developed. And these are things that are vital in determining a child's well-being in current time and also in their future. But unfortunately, studies and statistics have shown that this is also a very vulnerable time in one's life. Children face much higher risks in being in poverty and facing other forms of deprivations. In Malaysia, for example, in 2019, households with children, about 9% of them were considered poor, and this is higher than the national poverty rate of 5.6%. And I also want to add a caveat that when we talk about child-specific issues, these are not issues concentrated on the poor. In fact, if you look at issues like malnutrition, for example, from stunting to overweight and obesity, it is prevalent across income groups, from the B40, M40 to the T20. And these are not new issues. These are actually well established, well recognized, and it's reflected in the upholding of children's rights as listed in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, which Malaysia ratified. And one right that is relevant to our discussion today is the right of children to social security. As my colleague Adam mentioned earlier, Malaysia has no legal provision in ensuring social security for childhood risks. But that doesn't mean there aren't any government programs. There are actually a number of social assistance programs catered to children, but the coverage is very, very narrow, only limited to poor children. Now, for children in other income groups, children in higher income groups actually benefit from the tax system. Parents can claim for tax reliefs when they spend on child-related items like expenditure on breastfeeding, fees to kindergarten. So the missing middle issue is still very real and very much evident. So now, considering these two broad facts, which is childhood risk being prevalent across income groups and a system that benefits only the poor and some in the, a few in the rich, we propose in our report to establish a universal child benefit scheme, whereby we provide monthly benefit payments, unconditional monthly payments to every child until they turn 18 years old. So doing this universal program would address some of the issues I raised before, including the missing middle issue. It minimizes exclusion of those who are deserving, or we call it exclusion error. It eliminates social, administrative, physical barriers to social assistance programs. It breaks the cycle of poverty, and it stimulates the local economy because we're injecting cash to households. Now, the next question that we need to ask is, what would the cost be? And to accommodate the government's fiscal space, we advocate for a gradual expansion strategy, whereby we start off implementing the universal child benefit scheme for children aged 0 to 12 years old, and over time, we increase the recipient pool to cover all children aged 0 to 17 years old. Now, I just want to state that even by starting with only 0 to 12-year-olds, we're already capturing 70% of our children population and providing assistance to 40% of households. So that's already a wide reach. And the annual investment, at least the initial investment needed, if we provide 150 ringgit per month, that would amount to about 12 billion ringgit. And that may seem like a huge amount, but if you see this as a percentage of GDP, it's less than 1%. It's only 0.7%. And if we look at it over time, taking into account the projected increase in GDP, the declining population size of children, the share as a percentage of GDP, the annual investment share as a percentage of GDP actually declines over time. So it is economically feasible. And how do we finance this? There's a number of ways. Number one, we can consolidate and streamline existing social assistance programs such as Bantuan Prihatin Rakyat. And number two, we can use the tax revenue foregone from child-related tax reliefs. And this would give us about 14 billion ringgit to spend, which is higher than the 12 billion ringgit bill I mentioned earlier. So I hope that we give much deeper thought into implementing this universal scheme because it is feasible financially, it's a right of our children, and also it benefits us in the long run. So thank you. I did that.
Thank you so much, Jared, and thank you for the comments from our viewers that they posted on the chat section. There are a lot of questions, a few questions that we can consider to be put in the discussion based on the panelists' discussion just now. But moving on to Siti, the question is, well, moving from childhood to the next stage of life, working, for example, few of us are privileged enough to be protected from working-related risks. What are the most prominent social protection gaps, and how can we improve this?
Thank you, Ismail, for the question, and good morning, everyone. So actually, Adam has highlighted that, large part of social protection for the working age population is actually through the social insurance model. So when people make contribution. But when we look, a little bit wider in terms of, who are the working age population and not just, formal sector employees, actually, quite close to about 60% of them actually do not have access to this formal social insurance scheme. And this would include people who are not categorized as employees, your self-employed, your unemployed persons, people who are just in transition from school to work, people who are outside the workforce due to care responsibilities. And while they are in these phases of their working age life, they are not excluded from the risks that current social insurance schemes are covering, things like injury, invalidity, and suddenly losing your income source. And these are actually a real risk to the working age population as a whole. Now, we actually must applaud the government at least, there has been some effort to introduce new voluntary schemes for self-employed workers back in 2019. And, we're very happy to hear that, new schemes are also introduced for housewives and homemakers starting next year. However, one key concern that we have with voluntary scheme is actually the low uptake rate. And if we look, for example, the existing self-employed social security scheme to cover injury risks, compared to the total number of self-employed as of this second quarter this year, excuse me, the total number of contributors is only about 12% of the total self-employed in the country. So very, very low uptake rate. And actually, this is not a Malaysia-specific issue. When we look internationally as well, a lot of these voluntary social insurance schemes tend to have very low uptake rates. And Ismail, in the long run, this is something that we should be concerned about, because if the size of the insurance fund remains small, we cannot pool risks effectively. And that means that eventually maybe the premium would be unaffordable and maybe the benefit levels could not be sustainable. So in the end, the strength of the social insurance model might be weakened because we have this issue of low uptake rate. Now, I think moving forward, as we advance and as we recover from the pandemic, the work has to be about strengthening the social social insurance model and to reduce that gap. And it must be about expanding mandatory coverage to a wider segment of the working age population so that we can have a very strong fund to support the population. And, the government is aware of this. Since last budget, there has been some contribution assistance by the government to selected self-employed workers, and even we read from news that the government has announced that it will help poor housewives to contribute to the new scheme for homemakers starting next year. But I think I would like to pull another finding by KRI in another research that shows that actually at least 70% of households really do face significant consumption trade-offs in dealing with day-to-day expenditure because the income structure is quite low. And this means that actually beyond just selected self-employed workers as well as just poor households, they might need government assistance to contribute into the system to begin with. And so what the report proposes is actually continued and strong support by the government to push more people into the social insurance scheme so that they can make consistent contribution. But we have to remember as well, the idea of social protection is larger than just contributory schemes. So the report also, provide some suggestions that we have complementary tax-funded assistance for people who fall through the cracks, who can never benefit from the benefits from an insurance model. And one of the examples is actually providing complementary unemployment benefit or job search allowance for people set at least at the poverty per capita level, and perhaps could be longer, up to maybe 6 months, so that if they cannot benefit from the benefits from the insurance model, they at least have tax-funded assistance to prevent them from falling into poverty when they face risk like unemployment, for example. And we also must remember, as what Howard said, it has to be poverty mitigating, and the beauty, or I think the key of why we need a system is because then when you help people with income assistance, there are also other complementary and empowering policies that we can help support them. For example, recipients of the employment insurance benefit not only get income replacement, but they also get access to other active labor market policies like training. I think I'll stop there. Thank you, Ismail.
All right, thank you so much, Siti. Well, moving on from Siti, let's move on to Suraya. Well, the question is, for some group of people, they work so that they can retire, but we know that retirement adequacy is a major problem in Malaysia. And within this, how do we move forward, Suraya?
Thank you so much, Ismail, for the questions. And I think you are exactly right. Many in Malaysia do not have enough retirement saving. And unfortunately, this is a long-standing issue, and it has actually been discussed quite extensively in the past 10 to 20 years. COVID-19 withdrawal schemes, I-Lestari, I-Sina, and now we have I-Chitra, have actually brought the issue of retirement once again to the forefront. According to the EPF statistics, almost all of its members, about 80%, more than 80% actually, are expected to not be able to meet the basic saving targets of about 240,000 ringgit by the time they age 55. So those who have EPF accounts do not have enough. But we often forget that most adults aged 15 to 64 are not even saving with EPF. And then on top of that, they are not working with the civils or the public service that may entail civil service pensions. This is about 60% of working age population, and this proportion has not changed much in the past 10 years. So I guess the next question is, can we then actually retire I mean, like as individual, we can of course encourage everyone to save more or work longer. But I think we need to recognize like our ability to save more or work longer depend on so many factors that at times they feel that they are outside of our individual control. And I think the COVID-19 pandemic is actually a prime example of this. So given the statistics I mentioned earlier, if we are unable to protect ourselves individually, purely by our own efforts, the question is, can we do that collectively? Ismail, like one of the easiest and perhaps the best way is to just provide cash transfer to all adults. This can be at over age 60, 65, 70 or 75, so on and so forth. And then we have example of this in Malaysia, which are 1, civil service pensions, and 2, bantuan warga emas. But these 2 schemes are actually limited and exclusive to a very narrow group of people. They are not universal. But we have to recognize that how do we fund this is through tax. So given that if Malaysia is facing fiscal constraints, and if we is expected to have more and more older adults, which by the way, I'm sure the audience is aware, last year we reached the aging status, and by 2060, the time where many of us will retire, Malaysia is expected to reach a super aged nation status with over 20% of our total population age 65 and above. So given these challenges, maybe perhaps that we need to explore other financing options. So one alternative that we put forward in the report is social insurance pensions. So what does this mean? So it means that every one of us, we start by putting in a little bit of money as we work into a fund, a collective fund. And then by the time we reach a certain age, the fund will be dispersed to everyone as an old age pension. But then, of course, what happens if we are not able to chip in, we're not able to contribute, say that we fall ill, we get laid off, we are unable to work because we need to care for our children's or older parents. This is when the government needs to come in. So the government has an important role to ensure the continuity of contributions across a lifetime. And Ismail, I have to stress, social insurance pensions cannot and should not be operated by private companies. We think we need to learn from international experience. It has to be operationalized and managed by public institutions with a public mandate and a legal backing. So I think we unpack this proposal a little bit in the report with the mechanic and also like some options to ensure that these schemes will not add additional burden to the rakyat. But I have to recognize like one main downside of this proposal, which is we are not able to see if we are committed to this collective fund, we will not be able to see the results immediately. The fund needs time to grow. It will be a slow process as we are planting the seeds now. Regardless, I think ultimately and perhaps more fundamentally, Ismail, we need to move towards the models where we minimize individual risks of facing old age income security by maximizing our collective potentials and benefits as we move towards a more aging populations. And the proposal that we put forward is an alternative, it's a proposal, it's a social insurance pensions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Suraya. Well, for all our participants, you can post your questions on the chat section and our authors will get back to you after this event, inshallah. Then we moving on to Marjan. The question is, well, how do we make sense of all these 3 seemingly separate policy aspirations? Marjan.
Right. Thank you, Ismail, for the question. So previously, my colleagues have talked about the drawbacks of the current system, meaning we have issues such as fragmentation, narrow coverage, exclusion of certain people, such as the issue of the missing middle, as well as adequacy, right? And in our report, we have proposed specific policy recommendations, such as the universal child benefit, expanding the employment insurance coverage, as well as establishing the social insurance pension. So these might seem like very distinct policy recommendations, but how we envision them to be is for them to be part under one institution. So in order to make these recommendations a reality, one thing you need is one strong social security institution. So Malaysia already has existing institutions. So what the government needs to do is just to strengthen it to make sure that it can consistently administer all these programs throughout the life cycle. The second thing that we need is actually a national social protection database. So meaning, database, registry, a national social protection registry. So meaning that this registry would host the information of all the participants as well as potential and future beneficiaries so that they would have access to all these schemes throughout their life cycle. So what we want is for the universal child benefit to be the starting key entry point for people to be enrolled into the system. So let's say, for example, a child being born will be automatically registered into the universal child benefit program while simultaneously being registered into the national registry. So when you're in the registry, it makes it so much easier for all the other programs to kick in. So for example, as the child grows up, he reaches 15, the earliest age where you can start to work, he will be automatically enrolled into employment insurance schemes. Whereas when he reaches 18, then he would be enrolled into the social insurance pension. But he will start contributing once he would start earning. So that's what we want it to be. So imagine in the future, if all these proposals have managed to kick off, what would it look like for future Malaysians? So let's imagine it from an individual perspective, right? So for an individual, when he is born, he will automatically get the universal child benefit. As he grows older, he will be entitled to things such as job search allowance. And as we know that life is uncertain and we will face risk. So for example, as COVID has shown us, some people would be unemployed or fall sick, or he would have to be forced to work in the formal sector. What we want is for them, when they face this risk, that they would still be enrolled into employment insurance schemes throughout the way, so that he would still get benefits such as unemployment insurance or invalidity pension, for example. And when he finally reaches old age, then he would finally get that premium or annuity coming back from the social insurance pension. So that's from the individual side. So what would it look like for households, right? So for households, so the variety of schemes that we are proposing here ensures that households will be protected and entitled to benefits depending on their composition and life cycle, rather than having like a one-size-fits-all policy for all households, right? So imagine, let's say, for example, if you have a young household whose mother just gave birth, so the mother will be entitled to things such as the maternity grant, while the child will be entitled to a universal child benefit. Versus an older household, so the father who is just retired would get the social insurance pension, while the son who is just started working would be enrolled into the employment insurance schemes. So meaning he would be protected throughout his working career against any uncertain risk. So all these proposals, right, will create what we call the social protection floor, which guarantees minimum income security for people to make sure that we are protected against all these recognized risks throughout our life cycle. Thanks, Ismail.
Thank you, Marjan. She suggested that how the social protection floor schemes provide a minimum income security for all in stages of the life cycle. Then this will relate to the question for how. The basic question is, can we afford this, Howard?
Yes, thank you. You have put a very tough question for me. So, Ismail, yes. While there are many compelling reasons that we can make about the role of social protection, eventually the discussion have to be grounded by solid financial resources for it to be sustainable and long-lasting. But firstly, before I answer that, I just want to highlight that international evidence shows that a country's income level does not determine their investment on social protection. We have seen that there are some low-income countries, they have more political will to invest more on social protection as a percentage of GDP compared to higher income countries. And I saw a lot of questions coming in the chat asking about the spending and things like that. Unfortunately, we are not able to address all today. But in case you are interested, you can, on the question on spending, you can see a figure 2.3 in our report that shows how much we have spent on social assistance, and you can see that we spent about 45 billion in 2012, but this amount has gone down to 25 billion in 2019, just before we faced COVID-19. And you can see that's about 20 billion have been wiped out from this social assistance allocation. Where does it go? That's one. And if you are interested in terms of countries comparison, you can look at figure 6.9, where we shows that Malaysia now spend lower at 0.8% of GDP, relatively lower to our peer countries such as Vietnam, who spend about 1.8%, and Thailand 1.3%. So now, coming back to your question, how much does this cost? We have been able just to do a bit of rough calculation. Our estimation in order to kickstart this social protection floor that provide protections to everyone would cost about 1.1 billion of 1.1% of GDP, or about 17 billion. But this amount seems substantial particularly under current situation. But I want to remind that we don't have to roll out all this all at once. We propose for progressive realization strategy, where we can prioritize which subpopulation group that we can focus first. For example, in our report, we propose to focus on children, because children are our future and they are hard hit in this crisis. And we also propose for government to also focus on residual working age population who don't have social protection at all. And then we have been talking about this fragmentation, small scale program that actually cost administrative costs can be duplicative. So if we have this will to actually consolidate and streamline a lot of expenditure under social assistance alone, I'm not talking about other expenditure outside social assistance. If we have this will to actually streamline, then our estimation that to just focus on first scheme on children and working age, it will just cost about 2.4 billion. And we feel that this amount is very, very affordable and very worthwhile investment for the people. And secondly, I want to highlight at the same time that we don't have to start from zero. We have well-established social insurance platform operated by EPF and SOCSO, for example. But what we need to do is to blend this financing mix from contribution from the government, as others have mentioned just now, so that government can assist for those who are not able to contribute. And in the case of income security for old age, I saw a lot of interest on this idea. I mean, this is idea that we want to put up to the public for further discussion. But we saw that this is memang the gold standard is really to just deploy tax-funded social pension if you want to ensure social protection floor for all age. But the cost is really, really concerning. And we just want to offer this alternative. And we saw that this model can be more sustainable compared to fully tax-funded social pension. And I saw the question asking about what's the difference about this social insurance pension with EPF. And we have to imagine that we have multi-tiered social protection system whereby we want to ensure a floor for everyone, and then those can top up. I mean, the floor is just minimum standard, and people can just top up individually, as what EPF have been championing actually, to have this individual saving when they retire, and that's what actually we want. Okay. Finally, Ismail, sorry, I'm taking a bit of time. I just want to emphasize that we cannot see such protection as cost, yet it is an investment. And I think as we recover from this crisis, probably government will start to scale down their relief measure. Probably we will resort to austerity measures in order to reduce our debt level. But I hope this will not be at the expense of social protection. We need to integrate social protection agenda in our long-term development plan. And finally, last thing, I want to call everyone to read this report. because I think this report will just be a report unless there is a strong social movement at grassroots level that translate this report into action. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Howard. That concludes everything. Well, indeed, like what she said just now, social protection is regarded as an investment. In an investment, we have to be there to take the risk, and we have to move forward from the status quo to see a better future for our nations and for our country. So thank you so much for our panelists for today. Amongst them, thank you so much, Ms. Howard, Ms. Siti, Mr. Adam, Ms. Nur Suraya, Mr. Jared, and Ms. Putri Marjan, because sharing their thoughts together with us for today. Dan ini menggambarkan bahawasanya keseriusan mereka dan komitmen dalam penterjemahan laporan yang dikongsikan bersama dengan pihak awam pada hari ini. Terus saja kepada respon yang akan diberikan kepada Prof. Dr. Jomo. This is a question posted to Prof. Dr. Jomo. Prof, we have been discussing on the gaps and potential solutions, but how did we end up here in the first place? And then what has been the development in the global context?
Thank you very much, Ismail, and thank you for this opportunity to discuss this report, which I would like to strongly comment or emphasize at the outset. This is really a report to open a discussion, open a debate, which is really long overdue. We have to remember that this discussion of social protection is not really new. The language may have changed, the vocabulary may have changed, but almost half a century ago, in 1972, when the late Tun Razak put forward the proposal to establish Perkeso or SOCSO, many of these ideas were already being articulated at that time. And so this is not something new. Unfortunately, there has not been significant systematic follow-up. So I would like to emphasize that this is very much part of the Malaysian discourse. But as some other speakers have emphasized, this is also very consistent with international conventions. Not only the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the subsidiary conventions, including the rights of the child and so on and so forth, but it's also very important that to recognize that there are a whole range of other conventions subsequently, for example, of the rights of the elderly, of the aged, and so on and so forth. And very importantly, the ILO conventions, which have been established and so on. Malaysia has also been quite cognizant of many of these issues, and many of these principles which have been articulated today and in the report are actually very consistent with the social aspects of the so-called Sustainable Development Goals, which Malaysia is signatory to. So I think as far as international precedent is concerned and international standards are concerned, there is very strong foundation. The current discussion of social protection actually continues from earlier discussions of questions like social security, but need to be distinguished, for instance, from earlier, for example, during the time of the Asian financial crisis, of social safety nets. Because the presumption of social safety nets discussion is that the system is fine, that once in a while something happens and you need to go around with a safety net to catch people who fall between the cracks. But what has clearly emerged out of that experience from the 1990s is a recognition that the system leaves many people behind. There are many people who are left in very vulnerable situations, and very importantly, in more recent times, there's a recognition of precariousness, how precarious our conditions are. And this has been, I think, has been emphasized by Howard, among others. And this, I think, is very important for us to recognize. So the proposal which has been made by the team does not necessarily, for example, anticipate all problems. For example, I don't think you can look for all the solutions to COVID-19 in the proposal. But I think what we need to recognize right now is, as we recover, as we begin to think about the future, we need to recognize that the past was not all that wonderful. So building back better is not really such a wonderful slogan. because it assumes that what existed in the past was all wonderful. What we need to do is to build forward, to look forward. And this is why I think the proposal is particularly timely. People might say this is the worst time to introduce something like this. It is so expensive, it is so ambitious, and so on and so forth. But it's precisely at the moment when there is a shared sense of vulnerability throughout the nation, in fact, arguably throughout the world, that we recognize the need for this kind of social provisioning. And this, I think, is very important. The other element which all the speakers, beginning with Tan Sri, have emphasized is the whole element of a life cycle approach, that we are looking at it, sepanjang umur. This is something which begins, from cradle to the grave, if you want to put it that way. But I think it's very important to emphasize, as I like to, that it begins even before the birth of the child. Because if you think about the crucial first 1,000 days, it begins from conception. And if we do not take care of the needs of the mother and unborn child from the time of conception, we are going to have a lot of we are going to disadvantage children. So all the talk about equal opportunities and so on and so forth will not mean very much if you do not, for example, ensure that at the outset children have equal opportunities in terms of nutrition, in terms of physical development, as well as cognitive and mental development, as I think Jarod emphasized. So I think what is envisaged is a comprehensive approach. And I think we should really think about the problems which we face in Malaysia and how, looking at the international experiences, we can learn from international experience to move forward. This, I think, is what the team has. Not everything there is necessarily what everybody will necessarily agree with. And this is understandable. But I think what we really need now is a national conversation going forward. And this, I think, they have succeeded in doing. And I hope this event and others will contribute to this. Let me stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof. Jomo. Yeah, indeed, moving forward is the only thing that we need to do now in order to progress in our life and in order to progress for our nation. Moving on to yang berbagai Tan Sri. Well, Tan Sri, given your experience stewarding the nation out of the Asian financial crisis, and now as a member of the National Recovery Council, can we have, Tan Sri, your view on the role of social protection as part of the National COVID-19 Recovery Plan, Tan Sri?
Thank you, Ismail. The keyword is revival, National Recovery Plan. When we say it's a revival, what exactly do we mean? Does it mean that we go back to 2019, the days before COVID, and to the operating system existing in 2019? The answer is no, because the government has come out, clearly the ministers has come out, prime minister has come out to say that it's more than going back to 2019 operating system before COVID. It is 2019 plus reform. So reform for what? Reform for the future. What is the future? Because we have so many futures, depending on which trajectory we take, we can have so many futures, some plausible, some possible, some preposterous, but we want to basically go towards an agreed future. Different people may have slightly different view of what an agreed future is, but most reasonable people will agree that in that agreed future, we want the families, the households, to lead a comfortable life. At least that they will agree. Some reasonable people may have disagreement, that's fine. So if we want in the agreed future for families, all Malaysian families to lead a reasonably good life, a decent life, then we must start from now to build the building blocks, stack by stack, build the blocks towards that vision, towards that agreed future. There are many blocks, and of course we don't have time to discuss them now. But our purpose today is to put one block, one of the many blocks there, to say this is part of the agreed vision, the agreed future that we want. This is one block. This is the social security block. Having put the social security block doesn't mean we will boil the ocean, we will solve the problems. No, but this is a necessary, I think it's a necessary condition, not necessarily sufficient condition. It's a necessary condition to go towards that agreed future where all Malaysian families will have the opportunity to lead a decent life. Why is that important? That's important first because we want every family to be happy and lead a decent life by itself. I mean, that is a purpose by itself. But it's also a purpose for something else, because only if the families, the members of the families can lead a decent life, can they optimize their value for the government. They can optimize what they can do for king and country. And we want every Malaysian, irrespective of race, religion, strata, to optimize his or her value in, of course, earning a good living, but also to serve the king and country, so that when we put all that together, this beloved nation of ours will be a great country. Inshallah. Thank you very much.
InsyaAllah, thank you so much Tan Sri. Kami amat berbesar hati atas pandangan yang diberikan oleh yang berbahagia Tan Sri seketika tadi. Terima kasih diucapkan kepada yang berbahagia Tan Sri Nur Muhammad Yaakob, terima kasih kepada Prof. Dr. Jomo, dan juga terima kasih kepada kesemua ahli-ahli panel kita yang berkongsikan pandangan berkenaan dengan pembentangan laporan yang dianjurkan oleh Khazanah Research Institute. Untuk anda yang sudah menyaksikan kami, untuk mendapatkan pautan ataupun link to our reports, webinars dan sebagainya, anda boleh menyaksikan bagaimana caranya follow us on social media to keep up to date with our research. Twitter at KRI Institute, Facebook at KRI Institute, or www.facebook.com KRI Institute, LinkedIn Khazanah Research Institute, or Instagram KRI Institute, ataupun anda boleh mengimbas QR code bagi mendapatkan laporan penuh dan juga bahan-bahan serta materials yang berkaitan Building Resilience Towards Inclusive Social Protection in Malaysia. Itu yang dapat kita simpulkan pada hari ini, satu pembentangan yang mendapat sambutan yang mengujakan daripada para penonton kami. Terima kasih atas persoalan dan juga terima kasih atas beberapa pandangan yang dikongsikan. InsyaAllah para penulis kami ataupun penyidik kami akan berhubung rapat dengan anda melalui email juga platform-platform lain untuk memberikan jawapan kepada persoalan yang dikemukakan oleh pihak anda seketika tadi. Itu yang dapat kita simpulkan bagi pembentangan laporan kita pada hari ini, Building Resilience Towards Inclusive Social Protection in Malaysia. Bagi para penggiat media dan sahabat-sahabat media, diminta untuk terus saja bersama kami untuk kita membawakan bersama dengan anda pautan link yang akan disediakan juga untuk para penggiat media dan juga sahabat-sahabat media untuk sesi press conference seketika nanti selepas acara pelancaran report ini berakhir. Dan untuk peringatan sedikit ataupun perkongsian sedikit bersama dengan sahabat media, untuk sebarang persoalan anda boleh menggunakan button raise hand di ruangan penterimaan dalam talian kita pada ketika ini, dan juga anda boleh menyatakan nama dan juga dari media mana anda wakili untuk sama-sama kita kongsikan pandangan dan juga soalan anda dalam sesi sidang media. Maka sekian dahulu untuk pelancaran laporan Building Resilience Towards Inclusive Social Protection in Malaysia, anjuran Khazanah Research Institute. Kita harapkan agar perkongsian ini dapat memanfaatkan anda dan juga dapat memberikan satu gambaran yang menarik, khususnya cadangan-cadangan dalam kita menganjurkan dan juga kita memberikan terjemahan serta tamsilan yang lebih baik terhadap pelindungan sistem keselamatan sosial di Malaysia. Sekian saja buat masa ini untuk anda yang sedang menonton kami. Kami doakan yang terbaik buat anda dan juga untuk negara kita, dan teruskan bersama kami di ruangan dan juga pautan-pautan platform kami, Khazanah Research Institute. InsyaAllah kita akan bersua lagi dalam acara yang seterusnya yang akan dimaklumkan kemudian. Dengan itu, Assalamualaikum dan salam sejahtera.